The mountains were relentless that winter, their peaks veiled in thick clouds, and their slopes slick with ice and freshly fallen snow. Each gust of wind cut through clothing and bone alike, turning even the simplest journey into a test of endurance. Leora, a woman no more than 28, trudged through the knee-deep snow with her meager belongings bundled in a tattered sack. Her face, pale from cold and exhaustion, was streaked with dirt, and her hands, chapped and bleeding from exposure, clutched the straps tightly. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and weariness pulled at her every step. She had been wandering for days, evicted from the last town where she had tried to find work. Every door had closed before her, inns full, villagers suspicious, strangers unwilling to trust a woman alone in such a harsh land. Her pride had kept her moving despite despair, but the freezing cold made every step harder than the last. The thought of spending another night under the open sky made her shiver uncontrollably. Through the drifting snow, she glimpsed the faint outline of a cabin tucked against a slope, smoke curling from its chimney. A glimmer of hope sparked in her chest. She knew it was dangerous. People in the mountains were wary, and travelers often faced suspicion or hostility. But with no other choice, she pressed forward, her body trembling not just from cold, but from the uncertainty of what awaited her as she approached the cabin. She wrapped her scarf tightly around her face and raised a hand to knock. Each step crunched softly in the snow, but she knew it could not mask the sound of her presence. After a moment, the door creaked open. A tall, rugged man, Ethan, the cabin's solitary inhabitant, stood in the doorway, framed by the warm glow of the fire behind him. His eyes were cautious, wary of the stranger standing in the snowstorm. Leora bowed her head slightly, summoning her courage. I'm not worth much, sir," she said softly, voice trembling from cold and fear, "but I can cook." It was a humble offer, the last remnant of pride she could cling to, something tangible she could offer in return for a place to stay, even for a single night. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a long moment. He had seen hardship before, but he rarely encountered someone so openly honest, so vulnerable, yet still possessing the nerve to ask for help with dignity. His instincts warned him to be cautious. Strangers in the mountains could be dangerous, and he had his own reasons for keeping to himself. Yet he could see the desperation, the sheer exhaustion in her eyes. Something within him stirred, an old sense of duty, of morality that refused to ignore a person in need. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside and allowing her to enter. Relief washed over Leora in an almost tangible wave as she crossed the threshold into warmth. Her chilled fingers slowly began to regain feeling as she set her bundle down by the fire. Inside, the cabin was modest but inviting. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over wooden walls and simple furnishings. Ethan set a kettle on the stove and gestured toward a chair. Leora unwrapped her scarf and gloves, her body slowly thawing in the cozy interior. She could feel the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time in days. That night, she cooked a humble meal from the sparse supplies Ethan had on hand. The aroma of simmering stew filled the cabin, cutting through the lingering chill. For the first time in weeks, Leora felt warmth not only from the fire, but from the quiet sense of acceptance. She glanced at Ethan, who watched her work in silence. Though no words were exchanged, a subtle understanding passed between them. Trust was being extended, however tentatively, and a fragile bond was beginning to form in that remote cabin. Amid the relentless storm and isolation of the mountains, a chance encounter had changed the course of both their lives. Leora's honesty and courage had earned her shelter for the night, and Ethan had taken the first step toward realizing that this seemingly worthless woman might have far more to offer than he ever imagined. The morning after Leora's arrival, sunlight filtered through frost-laced windows, casting pale streaks across Ethan's cabin. The storm had finally passed, leaving a calm hush over the mountains, broken only by the distant calls of crows and the crunch of melting snow beneath boots. Leora stirred, stretching her stiff limbs, feeling a comfort she had not known in weeks. The warmth of the fire, the smell of freshly cooked breakfast, and the safety of the cabin formed a fragile sanctuary, one she had almost forgotten could exist. Ethan moved around the cabin with the familiarity of someone used to solitude. He kept a cautious eye on Leora, curious but not entirely trusting. After years of living alone in the wilderness, his instincts had been honed to spot deceit or weakness, and yet there was nothing in her demeanor that suggested danger. She was quiet, careful, respectful of his space, and remarkably competent. When she offered to help clean the cabin and organize firewood, Ethan hesitated at first. It was rare for him to share tasks, but the thought of letting someone help seemed oddly comforting. Perhaps it was the novelty of companionship, or perhaps it was her quiet determination that compelled him to accept. Together they worked in companionable silence. Leora swept the cabin, stacked firewood, and tended to the hearth, while Ethan repaired a broken window shutter and checked traps outside. Occasionally, their hands brushed or their eyes met, and small smiles broke the otherwise serious expressions on their faces. There was a rhythm to the work, a flow born out of necessity and survival, and in it, the first threads of trust began to form. After chores were done, they gathered near the fire. Ethan poured hot tea into tin cups and handed one to Leora. "You don't usually see people out here," he said, breaking the silence. "Especially not women traveling alone." Leora sipped cautiously, warming her fingers against the cup. "I had no choice," she admitted softly. "I've been alone for a long time. Hunger and cold leave no room for pride." Her eyes flicked to the fire, glowing with both reflection and a hint of vulnerability. Ethan studied her quietly, sensing the weight of her words. "I know what it's like to be alone," he said. "I came out here to escape people, to find a life where I didn't have to rely on anyone. But sometimes solitude is lonelier than anything else." For a long moment, they simply sat, the warmth of the fire bridging the distance between their pasts. Leora's voice grew steadier as she spoke of the challenges that had forced her onto the mountains, towns that turned her away, work that dried up, and the simple but relentless struggle to survive. Ethan, in turn, shared stories of his own lost family gone to illness, companions lost in accidents, and the years of living off the land. There was no boasting or complaint in their words, only honesty. As the day faded into evening, Leora prepared a small meal using Ethan's supplies and her own resourcefulness. He watched in silent admiration as she transformed modest ingredients into something nourishing and satisfying. She moved with purpose and efficiency, not seeking praise, but fulfilling her role quietly and competently. For Ethan, the act spoke volumes. It showed resilience, intelligence, and a capability that went far beyond cooking. By the time night fell, both were seated near the fire, a simple meal shared in silence. Though trust had not fully formed, a sense of connection was unmistakable. The mountains outside remained harsh and unyielding, but inside the cabin, two souls had found the first glimmers of companionship. In this quiet space, Leora began to realize that her worth was more than the meager skill she had offered. And Ethan, observing her strength, started to understand that even in the wilderness, human connection and mutual respect could thrive. The cabin, once a symbol of his solitude, was becoming something different, a place where two people could begin to heal, grow, and learn from each other. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered outside, both felt the subtle stirrings of a bond that might survive the trials ahead, a bond built not on necessity alone, but on shared understanding, resilience, and the quiet acknowledgement of each other's worth. The following week brought a storm fiercer than any Leora or Ethan had encountered in recent memory. Snow fell in thick. Blinding sheets, whipping across the mountains with relentless force, the wind howled through the pines, and the cabin walls groaned under the strain. Travel became impossible. The path through the wilderness was erased under feet of drifting snow for the first time. Both Leora and Ethan realized that they would be trapped together, relying entirely on each other's skills to endure inside the cabin. The atmosphere was tense but purposeful. Ethan checked his stockpile of supplies, dried meat, firewood, and a small reserve of grain and flour. Leora assessed what she could do to stretch their limited provisions. She organized the food, suggesting ways to make the rations last, and even found clever uses for items that might have seemed insignificant: tea leaves for flavoring, pine needles for insulation, and even scraps of cloth to plug gaps in the windows where the wind whistled through. "What you're doing? I never thought of that," Ethan said, watching as she rearranged the cabin's resources with meticulous care. "You think of things most people wouldn't," Leora shrugged. But there was a quiet pride in her eyes. "Surviving alone teaches you quickly." She looked toward him, and for the first time, Ethan noticed a confidence in her, not arrogance, but the calm, practical wisdom of someone who had faced hardship and persevered. The days passed slowly, marked only by the rhythmic crackle of the fire, and the occasional howl of the wind. Meals became small but nourishing, and Leora's cooking was central to maintaining morale. She had a way of turning the simplest ingredients into comforting, hearty food. Each bite reminded them that survival was possible, even under the worst circumstances. Beyond cooking, Leora proved resourceful in other ways. When the storm caused the chimney to smoke excessively, she suggested clearing the flue carefully, demonstrating a steadiness under pressure that impressed Ethan. She organized wood for maximum efficiency, made a temporary snow barrier at the door to reduce drafts, and kept spirits high with small acts of humor and kindness. Ethan, accustomed to handling everything alone, realized that her presence was more than helpful. It was essential during long hours by the fire. They talked about their pasts in more detail. Leora recounted experiences that had hardened her, stories of towns that turned her away, winters spent in frozen shelters, and the heartbreak of losing friends and family. Ethan shared memories of his own solitude, his regrets for the life he had abandoned, and the moments he had felt utterly alone. These conversations were not easy, but they forged a deep understanding between them. Trust, which had been tentative before, now began to root itself firmly. The storm reached its peak on the third night, trapping them in near-total isolation. A fierce wind rattled the cabin walls, and snow piled against the door in great drifts in the small, firelit space. Both faced the reality that their survival depended on mutual reliance. Ethan could handle the physical work, but it was Leora's intelligence, quick thinking, and resilience that kept them alive. She reminded him where resources were hidden, suggested the most efficient use of firewood, and kept the girl's spirits, if she had any children with her, nurtured with stories and warmth. By the time the storm subsided, Ethan had a new understanding of Leora's worth. She was more than a woman who could cook. She was intelligent, resourceful, brave, and resilient in ways that he had rarely seen. Her survival skills, her calm in the face of danger, and her quiet courage proved to him that she was far more capable and valuable than she had ever allowed herself to believe. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the snow-covered peaks, both stepped outside. Exhausted but alive, a profound sense of shared accomplishment and growing respect passed between them. The storm had tested them in every possible way, and together they had endured in the aftermath. Their bond was stronger, built on trust, necessity, and the realization that each had found in the other not only a companion but someone indispensable. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains gleaming under a crisp, clear sky. Snow sparkled in the sunlight, and the frozen pines shimmered like crystal, but the calm was deceptive. Even as Leora and Ethan ventured outside to inspect the cabin and assess the surrounding area, a sense of unease lingered. They both knew that isolation in the wilderness was never without risk. Humans were often as dangerous as the environment itself. It began with footprints, rough, large impressions pressed into the fresh snow. Ethan noticed them first. Scanning the area with trained eyes, "We're not alone," he murmured. Pointing to the trail leading toward the cabin, Leora leaned close, recognizing the signs immediately. "Hunters." "Or bandits," she said softly, her voice tense but steady. "They've been following this ridge. They might have seen us when we ventured outside." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had anticipated winter hardships, wild animals, and the dangers of weather. But people, especially desperate or unscrupulous men, posed a different threat. He quickly began devising strategies to protect the cabin. Leora, observing him, offered suggestions with surprising clarity and insight. "If they come, we can block the door with logs and leave a path that channels them to the left where we have the higher ground," she said, pointing to a ridge overlooking the clearing. Her mind worked like a trapper's, calculating angles, advantages, and weaknesses in their defense. Ethan was impressed, not just by her intelligence, but by her courage. "You're thinking ahead," he said quietly. "That's exactly what we need." Night fell, and the threat became imminent. The crunch of boots in the snow announced the arrival of several men approaching the cabin. Ethan took up his position near the window, rifle ready, while Leora moved calmly inside, ensuring the fire was low and the cabin concealed. Every action she took was precise, her hands steady, her movements deliberate. There was no panic, only determination and focus. When the intruders reached the cabin, they called out aggressively, demanding entry and questioning the presence of a stranger. Ethan answered, his voice firm but controlled, "This cabin is private. No one is entering." The men laughed, but Leora's quiet confidence caught Ethan's attention. She stepped forward beside him, her presence a subtle but unmistakable signal of strength. "You will not harm anyone here," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. "Leave or face consequences." Ethan watched as the intruders hesitated, clearly surprised by her composure. Together, Leora and Ethan created a united front. She handed him additional tools and suggested ways to use the cabin's terrain to their advantage. When the men finally realized that the pair were prepared and unflinching, their laughter faded, replaced by unease. After a tense pause, they decided the cabin was too well defended and retreated. Disappearing into the trees inside, Leora exhaled, tension leaving her shoulders. Ethan, looking at her with newfound respect, nodded silently. "You handled that well," he said. "More than well. You kept your cool. And you saved us both." It was in that moment that Ethan truly understood Leora's worth. She was far more than a woman who could cook. She was intelligent, resourceful, and brave, capable of thinking clearly under pressure and protecting not only herself but others. The storm outside had been dangerous, but these intruders demonstrated that human threats were sometimes more immediate and complex. Leora's courage and skill had been essential in surviving both that night. As the wind whispered through the pines once more, the cabin felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the bond forged through shared adversity. The mountains remained wild and unforgiving, but together, Ethan and Leora had proven that cooperation, intelligence, and courage could turn even the direst situation into a triumph. Trust had deepened, respect had solidified, and in the quiet aftermath of confrontation, both realized that their lives had irrevocably changed. They were no longer merely survival partners. They had become a team, bound by experience, courage, and the knowledge that together they could face the unknown challenges ahead. After the threat of the intruders had passed, The cabin felt like a sanctuary once more. The wind still whispered through the trees. But inside, warmth and light filled the space. Leora moved quietly around the cabin, preparing a modest meal from the remaining supplies. Her hands steady and calm, Ethan watched her for a moment, noticing the grace in her movements and the quiet confidence she exuded. She had faced storms, danger, and isolation, yet she remained composed, thoughtful, and resourceful. Once the meal was ready, they ate together in silence at first, savoring the warmth and nourishment. Neither had spoken of the previous confrontation in detail. Words were unnecessary. Each understood the courage the other had displayed. The shared experience of defending the cabin had created a bond that went beyond mere survival. It was built on mutual respect, trust, and recognition of each other's strength. As the evening deepened and the fire crackled, Leora finally spoke. "I've been alone for so long," she admitted softly, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "I didn't think anyone would ever see me as more than someone to be ignored or, worse, looked down upon. I've lost friends, family, a life I thought I had. It's made me cautious, and yet—" She trailed off, glancing toward Ethan, who had been listening silently. Ethan leaned back slightly, the weight of his own thoughts settling in. "I understand that," he said quietly. "I've lived alone for years. By choice, or maybe because I didn't know how to trust anyone again. People hurt you. Life takes what you think you need, and eventually you learn to keep to yourself. But seeing you here, surviving, you've shown me something I hadn't realized I was missing." Leora met his gaze, and in the silence between them, the tension of unspoken feelings lingered. She had expected judgment or indifference. Yet here was a man who recognized her worth, not for wealth or status, but for courage, intelligence, and resilience. Ethan, in turn, saw the depth of her character, her resourcefulness in survival, and the quiet strength that had guided them both through the storm and the confrontation with outsiders. Conversation shifted from past hardships to shared hopes and fears. Leora spoke of her dreams, however tentative, of finding stability, a place to belong, and perhaps a life where she could trust others again. Ethan shared memories of his youth, the family he had lost, and the solitude that had once seemed safe but had left a void he hadn't known how to fill. Each revelation brought them closer, not just as companions, but as people who understood the fragility and resilience of the human heart. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, a quiet intimacy settled over the cabin. Leora, once hesitant and unsure of her worth, realized that she had found someone who saw her completely, flaws and all, and valued her for her strength and character. Ethan, in turn, felt a connection he hadn't experienced in years, recognizing that true partnership was more than shared labor. It was trust, understanding, and emotional presence. By the end of the night, the bond between them had deepened into something undeniable. It was more than friendship. It was the beginning of trust rooted in shared experiences, courage, and mutual respect. Both knew that the wilderness around them would remain harsh, and that future challenges were inevitable. Yet inside the cabin, warmth, hope, and a burgeoning connection offered a glimpse of something extraordinary: the possibility of love and companionship in the midst of a harsh and unforgiving world. As they settled down to sleep, the firelight casting gentle shadows on the walls, Leora and Ethan shared a quiet understanding. Their bond, forged through survival and adversity, had grown into a connection that neither had anticipated, a partnership grounded in honesty, courage, and the recognition of each other's true worth. Spring finally arrived in the mountains, melting the last remnants of winter snow and revealing the rugged beauty of the wilderness. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of thawing pine and wildflowers beginning to bloom in sheltered valleys. For Leora and Ethan, the changing season mirrored a transformation in their own lives. The cabin, once merely a shelter from storms and solitude, had become a home in the truest sense, a place of warmth, partnership, and shared purpose after months of survival, threat, and discovery. Both had grown stronger individually, and together Leora's resourcefulness and courage had repeatedly proven invaluable. While Ethan's experience and steadiness provided security and guidance, yet it was their trust, respect, and the bond they had forged in the harshest conditions that now defined their relationship. They moved together seamlessly, not out of necessity, but out of understanding, a rhythm born of shared struggle and care. The morning began with chores around the cabin, but there was laughter this time, a lightness that had been absent during the long winter. Leora prepared breakfast while Ethan worked outside, repairing fences and tending to the small garden he had begun cultivating months before. The meal was simple, yet the aroma of fresh bread and herbs filled the cabin with comfort. They shared it at the table, smiling at each other across plates, a quiet acknowledgement of the life they had built together. With spring thaw, travel became possible again. Leora spoke of returning to a valley where some of her extended family lived, a place of safety and familiarity, yet neither of them was in a hurry. The journey would be long, and they would face the mountains together. Ethan offered to accompany her, a decision that surprised neither of them. Their partnership had evolved beyond mere survival. It was now a choice, a commitment to face the world as allies, and perhaps more, as companions in every sense of the word. As they traveled through winding paths and sunlit ridges, the natural beauty of the mountains revealed itself to them. Both Leora's eyes sparkled with renewed wonder, her laughter echoing through the canyons. Sani and Nayeli, if we imagine young children or others under her care, might have been there, safe in learning the ways of the land from Leora. But even in solitude, the two of them found joy in shared discovery. Ethan, too, felt a lightness he hadn't known since the solitude of his earlier life. The mountains, once imposing and isolating, now felt like a landscape where connection, courage, and hope could flourish throughout their journey. Moments of reflection deepened their bond. Leora spoke of lessons learned from hardship, the value of resilience, the importance of kindness even when the world is cruel, and the quiet strength of surviving through intellect and heart. Ethan shared his own understanding of solitude and perseverance, revealing that companionship did not diminish independence but enhanced it. Together, they found a balance neither had experienced before, a blend of self-reliance and mutual support. By the time they reached the sheltered valley that marked the end of their journey, the culmination of winter's trials and spring's renewal became symbolic. Leora reunited at last with distant family, but it was clear that her life had been forever altered by Ethan's presence. Likewise, Ethan had found not only a companion, but someone whose courage and integrity reshaped his understanding of human connection. Standing together on a small rise overlooking the valley, they watched the sun cast a golden glow over the mountains. The harshness of winter, the threats from outsiders, and the loneliness of the wilderness were behind them, leaving in their place the promise of a new beginning. Their journey had forged more than survival. It had built trust, love, and the understanding that worth is not measured by wealth or status, but by courage, heart, and the capacity to rise in the face of adversity. The cabin would remain a symbol of their trials, but the future stretched ahead, a life shared, challenges faced together, and hope renewed in the vastness of the mountains. Amidst the bloom of spring, Leora and Ethan stepped forward into a life defined by partnership, respect, and the extraordinary human capacity to transform hardship into connection.